Welcome, reanimated fans, to this week's episode. I am HA Conrad here from Brooklyn with my intrepid co-host Stuart Tiffin, an intrepid guest star Kyle Diaz.
No longer in Hawaii surrounded by chickens, but hopefully coming with some better audio fidelity today.
Did you bring some chickens home though?
No, that I think that's extremely illegal.
Yeah.
I was not
Um,
able to get any sort of foodstuffs through that Hawaiian security perimeter.
but you're back. It's good. You had a good time.
It was wonderful.
You're like, it's all right.
It's like
So I've been
pretty
back for
long
a few
ago.
weeks now here in Hawaii, in Seattle, where it's snowing again. So
Now it's snowing, and do you
it's a
have
distant
snow?
memory.
Stuart, you don't have snow where you are, do you?
We did have snow, but not in my town, but 15 miles north. They got a couple inches, and everybody lost their damn minds,
Yeah.
which is pretty rare on the valley floors here. Because I mean, 15 miles north of me is also Cloverdale, California, is also like one of the hottest places in Sonoma County. So it was just ironic that they also got like 3 inches of snow, but
So
pretty crazy.
But in any case, we were on a slight break just because some personal things got in the way, some familial things on my end. So, but hopping into it, we're going to do a review of two episodes today, and it's Please Hold My Hand and Endure and Survive. But before we get into that, we have one very small news item, not totally small, but kind of cool. I don't know. But for those of you who don't know, I Am Legend is going to have a sequel.
Maybe.
Maybe. It seems like they seem pretty like they're doing it, but maybe they're just hyping it up. I don't
It's
know.
been 14 years. I think 16.
Yeah, but I don't know. It seems like it's been a lot about it. But
Yeah,
anyway.
we'll see. We'll see.
But in any case, what they're going to do with this though is kind of ignore the ending of the movie that they had come up with, or the theatrical ending of the movie, and they're gonna do a new ending that is closer to what the book's ending was. So we shall see how that actually plays out. But regardless, I'm kind of excited to see it, and after this many years, I'm interested to see how they decide to kind of tweak this a little bit. Any thoughts on that?
I think it's really ballsy to come back after almost 20 years and be like, the ending of the first movie, yeah, forget that. We're doing a
I
different
know.
thing. And Will Smith, I'm sure, well, I don't know, is he attached to this project? He's not, I don't
Yes,
think. He
yes, he
he
is.
is.
And Michael B. Jordan.
Okay, so that's something to look forward to. I do remember that now. We've talked about this in the last couple of years. I sure.
It's pretty funny. I'm sure that the ending was changed because of studio meddling in the to begin with back in 2007. And it's really funny that they would have changed it to something where the star dies. I mean, spoilers for the end of I Am Legend, I guess, but basically you would think that they, even at that time, would have already been working in the mindset of, hey, maybe we'd like to make another one of these with Will Smith someday, and we don't want to have to awkwardly retcon him back into existence. But I guess they're just like, yeah, people can read about it online and they'll figure it out.
How are they gonna do this?
So they said that there was a different ending that they didn't show, and that they're gonna just I don't know. Do you think they'll like re-release the original and show that ending instead and hope that people forget? I don't know.
I think they might append it to the beginning. I
Yeah,
think they might literally just make it like the first scene of the movie.
they'll just have some 17-year-old footage of Will Smith, and then they'll be like, "This is how it ended, as you remember." Hint, hint, and then we'll. Wow, okay. I think it's a novel way to do something that's pretty crazy. So I look forward to seeing it.
Yeah, and I mean Akiva Goldsman is doing it, and he's been doing. I mean, obviously he was part of the original, but like, he was part of the Picard series, which I don't know if you've been checking out the most recent season, but it's a lot of fun, and it's all sorts of reunion-y things happening, so that's cool. So I'm on board with this. I'm on board with this.
Hmm.
Let's see what he let's see what he does.
Let's see where it goes.
But in any case, let's jump. Not a ton of news other than that out there at the moment, but we don't want to get put too bogged down in that anyway because we have a couple of episodes to talk about. And I feel like some people may have a lot to say about these episodes.
Oh, well, I imagine all of us do. Um,
I know.
these are some pretty iconic elements of, I'm gonna say it, the video game. So there's a lot of good parallels to talk about here, and I'm excited to dig in. These two episodes were both written by Craig Mazin and both directed by the same gentleman, Jeremy Webb, who I don't think has done an episode of this show in this run so far. So that's cool. When we last left off, which was many weeks ago in real life, we were talking about, it takes 8 hours to drive to Pittsburgh from 10 miles west of Boston. Do you recall that?
Yes.
I was going to, I have written in my notes here just geography rant because, and this problem exists in the game too, but in the first 3 episodes, we managed to get from Boston to Lincoln, Massachusetts, which, as we famously remember, is about 40 miles west of Boston. And then somehow in a montage over a Hank Williams song, they managed to get from Lincoln, Massachusetts to Kansas City, a distance of 1,400 miles. And I'm just having a really tough time believing they had a completely uneventful drive, except for a couple stops to siphon some gas.
There were probably some events, Kyle, but maybe not monumental events. I don't know.
I guess so, but geez, like when I realized that they were actually in Kansas City, like I've made that drive and it is so far. Like you have days in the car basically. We see them camping out for what, like one night, and I'm just like, no way, no, you would still be so far behind.
So there's a couple reasons. We know why they did this, which was because they're filming in Alberta, and nothing in Alberta looks like anything on the east side of the east of the Mississippi, right? Everything it's just too flat and prairie, and I don't know what else it looks like. Kind of like that scene of 10 miles west of Boston, which everybody freaked out about. So they had to move it for that reason, right? That's what Craig Mazin has said. But also, if you recall, Kyle, they do get to the western half of the United States in the video game after Pittsburgh. I think it's after Pittsburgh. I don't think that there's a lot of like interstitial parts of the U.S. that happen in the game either. They just kind of say 3 months later we're in the West.
It is a problem in the game, but New York to Pittsburgh is like what, maybe 3.5, 4 hours. So that's a lot more believable than 25 hours to Kansas City. And then I think the game does a little bit of a clearer job basically saying, and then a shitload of time passed. Like again, it takes them 3 months to get from Pittsburgh to Wyoming, which seems more reasonable in the post-apocalyptic landscape. It's not a big deal. It's kind of like in Game of Thrones when characters were just like, wing-wanging all around Westeros like in a day or two on the back of a dragon for distances that were supposed to be really long. But it definitely stuck out to me as like, wait, they're where? where are they right now?
I don't know. These are just flyover states. We don't need to worry about them.
You know what though, HA, you say that, but how many times have we skipped Chicago and zombie stuff that I've been like, show me downtown Chicago as a destroyed mass. I will say though, the driving montage that they do in not to skip over the beginning stuff, but that montage, the Hank Williams montage, the montage of decayed and like rotten middle, like those flyover states that Ellie's just kind of looking out the window and becoming despondent by looking at, that's incredible. Those are great sequences.
Yep, they are. But also, look, this is the first time, that she had whatever thought she had about what might be out in the world. We're seeing just a little bit of a different view. Like I think part of we saw her enthusiasm even towards the end of the episode 3, and you're seeing a little bit of like fear there, and there's like some interactions between the two of them, specifically the one when they're like kind of camping out in the woods, which gives you sort of an idea that she doesn't know what the world has become and still has a bit of hope or a little bit of like naivete. And Joel's very, direct but terse descriptions and comments. And then there's the building of the relationship between them. I felt like they both did a really good job in these scenes, even though there wasn't really dialogue. So I don't know. I thought it was all right and got us to where we were going. And otherwise, I just think it would be plotting and weird, and we're just gonna have repeats of what we saw, up until this point. So I think they're just kind of trying to move the plot along.
Yeah, the dialogue that they did have, I think, was introducing these really critical, well, puns. Just the
Yes.
jokes that is such a huge part of that chemistry between those two characters. So I was really glad that they brought that in, and that Pedro Pascal is still playing. Um, his version of Joel is just slightly different, and I've been enjoying how like resistant he is to Ellie at this phase of the story.
Look, he's trying to keep up his boundaries. We know that he's still suffering and mourning and grieving many things, not just Tess, but that's the most recent thing. And I would say he's even in some ways like that. I would say that note that he got from like in Lincoln was pretty, hit him pretty hard. And so I think he's trying not to like her, but he likes her despite himself. And so it's kind of fun to watch that dynamic and to watch his struggle there. Because she's pretty fun, honestly, given despite everything that they've been through. It really does egg him on a little bit, and she's kind of drying him out. And despite himself, he does tell her things, even though he says he's not going to, which I find to be kind of funny. And so,
Last time we spoke, I talked about how the show's creators were kind of playing this little trick on the hardcore game fans by having, several episodes where scenes were literally taken, frame by frame from the video game, and then having an episode where everything was completely different and changed around. And so I thought it was interesting that after the departure of the Bill and Frank episode, they're right back this week, kind of like reassuring everybody once again that, yes, we remember the game that this is based on. And as Stuart, as you alluded to, like all those initial driving scenes and the tape that she finds of the Hank Williams song and the porno mag that she discovers in Bill's backseat and the pun book, all that stuff is essentially word for word, note for note, leading into the firefight when they get to the place where they have to leave the freeway outside of Kansas City.
mm.
I did want to also, you'd already mentioned that she shows some naivety in the woods in their camping scene. She also, like for this very rare moment, shows vulnerability when she's asking him,
Yep.
those people you talked about, because he's saying like, we're too remote to be for fungus to come and find us, but the people, those are the ones we have to watch out for. And they wouldn't just want to steal our stuff. They'd have worse things in mind. He like kind of, I mean, I think he's trying to scare her, but he does too good of a job. And then she's like, nobody was going to find us out here, right? And then he ends up staying up all night, where at least you get the impression, because there's a scene of him like just standing there in the moonlight looking out into the trees. I thought this was a very interesting scene of him like giving in, because he still talks the talk. He's saying like, you're not family, you're cargo.
Mhm.
You only do stuff for family now, and that's all that matters. And she's like, I'm not family, but he's like, I know, but Tess is family, and I promised her, whatever. But he's clearly treating her like more than cargo, because she expresses that she's scared, and the result is that he stays up all night looking out into the woods. When his plan was to drive all the next day and the next night to get to Wyoming.
Right. And I also like, and there's also like there's some funny like little references just about like the sleeping bags and how they, she's like, mine smells good. He's like, yo, must have belonged to Wait, who did he say it belonged to?
Probably Frank, if that's
Frank,
the
I think
case.
he says. And then, they have this really funny back and forth about coffee because he had the coffee in his little like thermos and whatever. And she's like, this is disgusting. It smells disgusting. Like,
The biggest revelation there was that the QZ had Starbucks.
right. Nice little
Yeah, I thought that
Starbucks
was fascinating.
mention, right?
Sorry, I was just drinking some wine.
We're
After
drinking Starbucks.
you're drinking Starbucks, you're like a real QZ resident.
Yeah.
Um, Basically, there's a really funny smash cut. I love it when they do stuff like this. I'm a sucker for low-hanging fruit. And he's like, hey, look, you can get some sleep. She's like, I'm not even tired. Smash cut to her being completely passed out in the
Yeah.
mouth open, and they're pulling up to Kansas City, where the story kind of takes a twist. They already spent, I don't even know how much it was of the episode, but it took some time, like kind of building up this rapport between the two of them. I feel like it was 20 minutes maybe into the episode
Yeah,
when
I
they
think so.
arrived.
It was a good chunk.
Yep.
And so in the game when they're driving into Pittsburgh, it's a similar situation. Something is blocked. He's like, all right, well, I'm gonna have to take this exit, and he drives down this cleared path. It's a very similar situation, but then in the Kansas City open city section where they're just driving, it's not like they couldn't take a right or a left at some point. They're just lost,
Mm-hmm.
right? Whereas in Pittsburgh, they drive the only route that's open and they get ambushed, which makes more sense because there is a very fundamental difference in theory between the people who waylay them in Pittsburgh, which is they're murderers. They're just waiting to kill anybody who comes down the road and take their stuff. They might have just been taking their stuff. They definitely had one of those creepy rooms at Terminus where they were collecting all the teddy bears and
Oh, yeah,
shoes. But we don't get to see any of that set dressing in Kansas City, where suddenly they're just being ambushed, and they could have gone any number of other directions. It felt like. Did that seem incongruous to anybody?
Yeah, I felt like it was weird, like they had more avenues to not, I don't know, it just felt weird to me. But I felt like maybe this was a decision because of the way they had their set up or something. I don't know, but it didn't feel set up in a way that made you feel like this was the only route they had to go, I guess.
Yeah.
So I agree with you on that front.
And then one of the most interesting things to me is watching these two episodes for a second time, because when the second episode we're talking about today, episode 5, really fills in a lot of the gaps about what's happened in Kansas City over the last 10 days, right?
Yeah.
Like we're getting there on day 11 or day 10/11 of since the fall of Fedra. We know this because we've seen both episodes, but you don't have any of this information, this context.
No.
And yet these three resistance fighters, because they are in cahoots with Kathleen, they're not like, maybe they're doing something off book, but they are basically, what's their purpose? Do you feel like when Joel and Ellie drive into this ambush, and it's like they say I think one person throws out a line like, give us your stuff and then we'll let you live, I think.
Mhm.
But what is their purpose really? Just to be highwaymen?
I thought they were out looking for Henry.
So did I. And I thought that they thought maybe, I don't know, but it seems weird that they would think he would be with him just because, I don't know.
I think it was just a crime of opportunity. Like they were out looking for Henry, going door to door.
And then
see
they
this,
found the supply thing. Yeah.
random car just like driving through, and they're like, oh, let's take this opportunity to, to get some stuff, get some people, whatever they are hoping to get from these folks. But I think it's just a kind of a passerby kind of thing, which does seem a little bit less plausible. But the way that the story gives you this information, you don't really think about it till the second watch through. I did think, and this is kind of like relates to what you were saying, Stuart, that like basically I enjoyed watching this episode 4 more the second time. The first time through, I thought it was a little slow and I thought it was a little boring. And then after having all of the context of episode 5, it actually made a lot more sense. So I'm not really sure whether they paced this entirely correctly, but most people seem to go with it. So it probably worked out fine. There are also a couple of instances of really awkward blocking in these 2 episode pairs. So I'm not throwing Jeremy Webb under the bus for his direction or anything, but there's um, some moments in the big confrontation that happens at the end of episode 5 that I also like, just the spatial geography of the sets and the location where they had everything set up um, felt a little off to me, and characters felt too close together. So maybe it's just I'm sure it's kind of tough for them to figure out how to stage these things with all of the practical dressing and stuff they have to do on site.
Okay. Can you just define blocking?
Like where the characters are in relation to the physical space of the set. So this kind of goes back to what HA was saying about how like the the kind of random nature that they come across these folks, and you don't really know where they're supposed to be or how they came across this. It goes back to how you were talking about how they were funneled into something in the video game.
Yeah. Okay. Yes. I did really like seeing, that same pickup truck from the video game encountering the same looking bent over dude saying, "Please help me, I'm injured," or whatever it was. I missed in the video game, Joel says, "Oh, he's not even hurt," when Ellie's like, "Aren't we gonna help him?" He just says, "Hell no," or whatever, and drives. In the show, which I don't know, maybe that was too like on the nose to include in the show, but this is a video game scene where they encounter these highwaymen and end up in a storefront with their truck disabled and have a shootout. It's a cool scene in the game. It's a cool scene in the show, and you get to see it from another angle in the next episode, which is also super cool. So it is kind of hard in a way to separate these 2 episodes because of that extra perspective, because you realize that Henry and Sam are across the street watching it, or just Henry really. Which also a realization I had the second time I watched episode 5, those 3 guys were right outside and they were about to walk out and would have gotten caught.
Yep.
Which I was like, head explode. It did not occur to me until the second viewing. So this might be one of those shows you got to watch a couple times. But this altercation results in some big stuff. What did you guys think about the shootout and how it ends?
I thought that watching it a second time, I think you do have to watch these 2 episodes twice to get the context, and it's a lot better if you do it. In terms of the shootout, I felt, not having really played the video game, like it felt like a bit like a video game in sort of watching how it played out. But I also really liked Ellie's reaction and Joel's reaction, and really, given the fact that there wasn't a ton of dialogue for like the first half of this, we just see these like little breaks, and you see them kind of building this rapport, even though it's somewhat strained. This particular thing, because it's so urgent, you see Joel's immediate reaction, and if there was any doubt that he was protective of Ellie, it is all, we've seen his sort of like instincts kick in before, but here it feels a little different. And she listens to him, even though she's also terrified. And he's immediately trying to find options, find ways for her specifically to get out. And I like how it all plays out, so that ultimately she does save him, or at least distracts enough so that he can take care of it. And I thought that this was it was weirdly quickly moving, but there was so much information packed into these few moments that in the second watch I was just like, wow, this is just, I thought it a little bit the first time, but the second watch really, it sort of sunk in, and you could see it almost just, they have this incredible rapport and dynamic, and there's so much that is nonverbal. And I think that Kyle pointed this out before, is that just even the looks passing between them, the expressions, it's just a really, I don't want to say it's better than it has any right to be for this silly little shootout, but it kind of is. So that's what I thought about it.
There's a couple things here that I think are interesting, just to add to what HA was saying about the shootout. They're doing something very interesting with Joel throughout these 2 episodes, and then continuing into future episodes that we have the benefit of seeing because we're recording a few weeks off from the show schedule, where they're really showcasing more vulnerability in him than they ever did in the video game. In the video game, he's basically Superman. I mean, he just mows through people and he never has a moment of physical weakness in the kind of canonical storyline he does if you die over and over again because you can't get past the stupid boss or something. But here he has like, you know, a little bit of a tough time hearing, so he can't hear the guy sneak up on him, who Ellie eventually has to kill. Um, Later in this episode, that hearing thing will catch up to him again. He's noticeably winded when he's trying to run around and do stuff at a couple of different points. So they're developing this kind of like aspect of his character where he's kind of past his prime and not sure if he can do this anymore. That I think is a really, really, really fascinating choice, and I think it's really interesting and a departure from the source material.
I totally agree. They are laying the groundwork for episode 6, which I assume we've seen. HA, have you seen 6?
I started to watch it, but then when you said I was a little bit off in what I
Okay.
thought we were talking about because I made up a solo show that we didn't do because I was sleep deprived.
Well, so don't worry about it. I will not
Yeah.
go into more detail, but this what Kyle is saying is right on the nose. They are laying the groundwork for some stuff that does not exist in the game, which is that Joel, this 56-year-old person, is indefatigable in the game, and yet Pedro Pascal is like, nah, dude, I think he can't climb 45 flights of stairs. So I'm sure.
But they even hit this like early on where Tess said this and he said this, and you know they keep making reference to his knees. And it's like his old knees. And while I appreciate that, I just think it's kind of funny, and I do like how it adds to this because you know, he has old injuries and things like that, and he references them, and so he's not just this sort of automaton that is this unrealistic superhero. This is just a very human person, right? So I don't know.
Yeah. The other thing that I think is interesting here with the shootout is that the young soldier, or the resistance fighter rather, who they shoot and then Joel has to kill, um, starts begging in a really heart-wrenching way. And you don't really get the full sense of this until you have watched both of the episodes. But essentially, these resistance fighters, they're actually the heroes of some other movie. Like there is a movie in which this ragtag group of folks who overthrows Fedra is, you know, actually the heroic heroes of the story. And there's some interesting kind of like subtextual commentary here that we should get into at some point about, you know, whether Fedra is a good thing or a bad thing in this world that we can talk about when we get to episode 5. But you know, I think that a lot of shows would just kind of have these be kind of nameless, faceless people who just get dispatched without much difficulty, and that this little moment here is for Joel and Ellie kind of a moral choice, and a gray one at that. So I just thought that was an interesting choice for the creators to make.
Well, and you make a good point, because one of the notes that I wrote down, especially during the second episode, it's like would these be the good guys? Like if you looked at this from a different perspective, right? And I know that there's some ways that you can look at, you know, one specific character and kind of argue against that, but depending on how you look at it, like the story that is told, as you said, like they, against all odds, basically were able to fight the tyranny that Fedra had, you know, and you hear the stories of Fedra during these 2 episodes, which, you know, they do seem justified in what they did, in terms of, or at least to the, you know, in terms of like getting out from under their rule. And so I thought that was a very interesting way, and the sort of little like breadcrumbs they lay to sort of bolster that narrative, and it makes it makes, at least it made me feel a little bit off kilter, so much so that with Henry, it was, especially as they reveal more and more about him, I was just thinking that it was just such an interesting way to do a like sort of a character reveal of him. And then, you know, it sort of sets it on its head, and it puts you into this interesting spot where it's like, well, in another universe with other information and a different interaction, Joel and Ellie could have been helping out this sort of resistance group instead, right? So I thought that was an interesting way to have this all play out and unfold. And even when you have the character that Joel ultimately kills, and he doesn't hesitate too long, but the guy is saying things like, just let me go and bring me to my mother, and like things like,
She's right over there. Yeah, like
yeah,
it's
like it's really like it's just an interesting and honestly like heartbreaking thing to happen, and you're just like, I don't even know which way is up. They packed so much into this little weird scene, so it's like a strange little gunfighting scene that normally would just be over and done with and you wouldn't even think about it, but they make you think about it, and I think that shows just the talent and the artistry that they have that they have poured into the show.
And
So
the intent, it's very mindful how they're doing this. And I don't think we're going to run into too many black and white characters throughout
no,
this
no.
game, or too many black and white decisions. And like to add, just to put a final nail in this section of the story, this ambush, Ellie makes this decision to go out and intercede and saves Joel's life. In doing so, in shooting this kid, paralyzes him, and you can see it all on Bella Ramsey's face, where they're not really the way that the camera is like lingering on her, and then she looks at Joel. They're not. I mean, they look at the kid a little bit, but it's a lot about her reaction to having done this and what she's feeling, which they don't talk about really. They do later. He does ask her about, are you okay, in a very awkward scene later. But she almost starts to like basically break down in this scene, and then quickly walks back and goes back through the hole in the wall to wait until he has dispatched Brian. And I just thought that this was it's fascinating, and I think it's really, she's doing great work. I continue to be impressed by the young Bella Ramsey.
Mm-hmm.
And the next scene where she's like dragging a desk away from a door to let Joel in is, I've done that 100 times in that video game. So yeah, I feel that too. So they then like they move off. They like, I don't know how much they didn't. Joel like got one or two things out of the truck, I assume. He basically left a treasure trove in the pickup truck, is the impression you get, because Perry later tells Kathleen, "Oh, it's loaded. They're mercenaries," right? But they get out with their backpacks and a rifle and whatever, their two handguns, and hole up in that like barber shop. And before we meet back up with them in that shop, we meet Kathleen and Dr. Edelstein. Who has seen Yellow Jackets on this podcast? Because I have not.
I have not.
I have seen Yellow Jackets.
But Melanie Lansky is also in Fargo and a bunch of other things, and she's awesome. So
she is the scariest kindergarten teacher I've ever encountered. I've never seen her in anything else, but holy crap, is the rest of her body of work at this level?
She is. The first thing that I actually ever saw her in was Heavenly Creatures, which was, did either of you see this?
Is that a Peter Jackson movie?
Yes, it is, and it was with Kate Winslet and Melanie Lansky, and she was super young in it, if I recall correctly, and she was insanely talented and amazing then, and I think she was like, I want to say she was a teenager, but she might have been a little bit older. And it was like this, the basis of that movie were these two girls that ultimately killed one of the girls' mother in this, the character that Melanie Lansky plays her mother, and she's terrifying in it. But they both are, but like, and she's very pathetic. It's like a very deep part for somebody like to just, and I'm sure she was in other things before that, but that was the first thing I remember seeing her in, and that was like 90, I want to say it was like 95 or something like that. And so she just continues to impress. Just but this thing is, you know, her unwavering um it's brutality, but it's also like it is a brutality that is sort of in this particular role, a brutality that she feels is justified, and to her there is no gray area. Like if you did a certain thing, she does not care who you are, and this is just like, to me, the exact, I mean, they play this absolutely well, where, you know, she's incredibly effective at what she does. She leads these people, but where is she leading them and why? And it's sort of like losing the ultimate perspective, because, you know, the bigger issue, or the bigger sort of, I don't want to say the bigger big bad, is still out there, and they're focusing on basically not, I guess, vengeance, yeah, on people that they think have wronged them or wronged them towards Fedra and things like that. And so,
She's
and
certainly not focusing on her seventh priority,
no,
because it's not Henry. Henry's priority number one.
right.
But I think that's from episode 5. That was a funny quote. Kyle, tell us about her role in Yellow Jackets.
So Yellow Jackets is when she first came on my radar, and I think that there are other roles that she's not absolutely terrifying in, because I know, for example, that she was on Two and a Half Men for many episodes. So I don't know. I don't have not familiar with what she did on that show, but I can't imagine there was anything like this. She is an absolute tour de force in Yellow Jackets. It is she's the closest thing that the show has to a main character, and she is vulnerable and terrifying and intense, and kind of like everything in that she is here cranked up to 11, and also more kind of competent and ruthless. So I think that actually Yellow Jackets is a better showcase for, you know, the role that she's kind of also doing here, but just again, like turned up even further.
I know that she's had to, or not had to, but she has taken to Twitter, and I haven't read that she was getting criticized for, or the show was getting criticized for casting her in this role. And I understand that she went on Twitter and was like defending the casting. I mean, first of all, I don't see any reason to criticize this. I think a wolf in sheep's clothing is one of the cooler ways to do a character, and she is definitely that way. Like, she looks, like I said, like a kindergarten teacher or soccer mom or something, and yet she is unrelenting and gives no fucks, and I just love this character. So I was super psyched about it.
I also think, and we keep coming back to this, but the weird way in which they dole out information here might have contributed to that sentiment amongst kind of people who were watching the episode, because when you first meet her, you're kind of like, oh, how did this person, you know, get this fanatical, you know, group of people to follow her? And she doesn't seem like a strong leader at all. She's making all these, you know, impulsive decisions, and she kind of like changes her mind from moment to moment, and she just doesn't seem like a very good leader. So like, how could you possibly get all these people to follow her? And then you know, in the second episode of this pair, learn that she's actually only been the leader of these folks for about 5 days, and
Right.
very, very, very quickly leads everyone to ruin, you know, almost instantly. So no, she's not a very good leader. That's the whole point that the show is, you know, is setting up, that she's this kind of weak, impulsive person obsessed with vengeance, and who's ignoring these other very obvious, important things that need to happen. But in the first episode, you don't have any of that context. So you're just, the impression that I got in episode 4 was basically like, you know, wow, this seems like a pretty, you know, unimpressive person to be leading this group in a way, where she just shot their only doctor, you know, on a whim. So yeah, you don't quite understand what they're doing with her until episode 2, where you're like, oh no, this is a story about a resistance, you know, essentially being the dog that catches the car and then getting dragged along behind the car, you know, miserable.
uh, Part of the reason why you learn about why her followers follow her is because of a line delivered by the character of Perry, who is kind of her lieutenant and her shadow in many scenes. And he is played by Jeffrey Pierce, who voices Tommy, Joel's brother in the video game. He has apparently described the success of his casting as the beard did 90% of the work, which is, I think, is a funny thing to say. Um, and so yeah, he is he's a great. I mean, he doesn't do that much, but the few things that he says, certainly that one line that he delivers to her in her former childhood bedroom in episode 5, really
Mm.
does kind of pave the way for you to understand why she is the leader of the resistance. Okay, so we meet Kathleen. She kills the guy who delivered her,
Hmm.
not just her pediatrician, her actual like labor and delivery doctor,
Yep.
uh, because he's a collaborator.
And she kills him, a doctor with a set of skills in this apocalypse. And she thinks about it for a minute, like when she thinks that maybe he can help save somebody, and then obviously he cannot, but she's like, all right, well, I'm just going to get rid of him, because she's like, oh, because Henry's clearly responsible for this death, so since this is a collaborator, I'm going to get rid of him. So you see in that moment just how her reason is completely overwhelmed by her need for revenge. And it's I think that it's just a really interesting way to introduce her, because then you do find out more and more about her. um and as I said, this show messes with your mind, because you're like, okay, I can kind of see her perspective. Like, I can see how she got to this point, or how anybody could get to this point. And so she's quite decisive, and she, as you said, she does not care at all. Like, she's just like, I'm gonna continue on my mission here, and nobody's gonna get in the way. And I also think that she wants to appear to everybody else and show that she is like full of strength and not yielding, even though these could ultimately be bad decisions in the end. But I don't know, there's like a menace to her that is impressive, and I just don't think you would mess with her. I think Henry is right to both of them were right to have been hiding from her in this particular sense. But you know, they don't give us much more of her in this particular scene. Like, they then jump to back to Joel and Ellie. Is that right?
Yeah, where he's awkwardly asking her if she's okay
Yeah.
and fumbling through that interaction.
Yeah.
Which ends perfectly, in my opinion. He does the one thing that was going to mend his relationship with her. Because you know how I said what I was talking about earlier, where she seems so broken right after she shoots Brian, in the face anyway. But as soon as he comes into the room where she was hiding, she's kind of back to her banter a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
And now she's sitting down. She's like kind of crouched. He starts to try to like fumble his way through asking her if she's okay and if she wants to talk about it,
Mm-hmm.
and saying, "Oh, it's not fair. You're too young to have to deal with this." And she admits that it's not the first person she's killed,
Nope.
which from a 14-year-old should be a very shocking thing to hear, but I guess not in a zombie apocalypse. And HA, you're like, doctors in the zombie apocalypse are so important. We need them, but I'm sorry, we know better. We've watched enough Walking Dead. How many doctors have they killed on that show? Like
They kill
15.
all the doctors. I mean, they are the red shirts, definitely. But
It's messed up.
it's still like being killed randomly by like a, I don't know, um as opposed to going in and deliberately shooting him, still knowing that those skills like could be used because you're so pissed. Different thing, but anyway.
But the thing that Joel does correctly in this scene is give her back her gun, this little Beretta 32 caliber. Um, and this makes her happy. And on top of that, he shows her how to hold it, and that makes her happy. And it kind of like mends everything. Everything's better because he's given her back her gun.
Gun lessons, yeah.
And even though he's like, put it in your backpack, you're gonna shoot your butt off, she still sneakily puts it in her jacket pocket because she can never quite do exactly what he tells her. she's always got to have her own little piece of the agenda. Um, and then their plan is to find the tall building and go up to it uh once the patrols stop, because they're doing all these house to house searches, and to climb up the tall building and see how they can get out of town. And that's their plan, and that's what they do, I think. Isn't that like kind of how the
Yeah.
episode continues?
Yeah.
They basically climb right up. They get to 33 floors out of 45, because that's as far that was their plan, was to go as far as Joel could make it, which I
Yep.
thought was also a funny line. And then they settle down in an office. He puts all the glass on the floor, and it's the second scene of the episode where she's trying to get his attention and ends up having to yell at him before he will turn around and be like, "What?" So they're not like laying it on too thick, because I also didn't really pick up on this until rewatching it, even though but I'm not the most intuitive viewer of things. Um, like, dude's deaf. Dude cannot hear, and certainly putting all that glass on the floor did not save him from the end of this episode.
And the end of the episode, of course, is our first introduction to Henry and Sam, where Joel wakes up and they're being held hostage by Henry and by a small child with paint on his face, which I was kind of like, oof, like, we see that this goes down relatively amicably, but there is no way that small child is gonna do well matched up against Joel. I thought they picked an interesting, you know, way to split up that workload between the two of them, with Henry going after Ellie and then Sam having to cover Joel from like 6 inches away.
With two unloaded weapons, though, we learn in the next episode.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
So that, but that's context that is important. Yeah. So again, we come back to this, like the way that they've chopped this together. You learn that pretty soon into the next episode, is that they have no bullets in any of their guns. But do you think Joel would have done something to Sam in this scenario? I don't know. Especially not now that he has an Ellie in his life.
If things had gone wrong and they were more threatening than they came off as,
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think there's much Joel wouldn't do to protect Ellie, especially.
All right, fair enough.
But at the very least, he could disarm him. I mean, he's an 8-year-old kid.
He is an 8-year-old kid, which is noteworthy, because this next episode we kind of get more into the Henry and Sam story. In the video game, Sam is about the same age as Ellie. He is a little more passive than her in the game. He does not have any weapons. He's mostly just like a character who follows you around. But it does change the way that the events of this episode of the show play out. Also in the game, Henry and Sam are not from Pittsburgh. In that case, they are just travelers. They're also trying to avoid the gangs of roving people who have freed themselves of the yoke of Fedra, but who are now just killing anybody they can get their hands on and stealing their stuff. Like, that's kind of the Pittsburgh version of the story of the Resistance. They don't have like a bright side. They don't have like a sympathetic story the way that this Kansas City group do. They probably do, in that the Fedra people were oppressive, but in Pittsburgh they are just waylaying folks and stealing their stuff. And they have and you can find lists of, this on this day we got this much stuff from the tourists, they call them, who were dumb enough to come to Pittsburgh, and we trapped them and killed them and took their stuff. Versus in Kansas City, we quickly get plunged into the story of, like 10 days ago, I guess, is the first couple scenes from this episode. It's like a party in the streets. They're shooting off flares, waste of flares in my opinion, but they are celebrating their victory over the Fedra forces with some brutal killings and a lot of partying in the streets. What do you guys think of these scenes?
It made me miss just a little note about this, the structure of these episodes, but we've seen them do a lot of different things with the introductory scene from each episode. So in the first 2 episodes, we got kind of flashbacks. Actually, in the first 3 episodes, we got flashbacks. maybe not in the first scene, but in the first couple of scenes. And then since then, we haven't had a flashback to the pre-pandemic time, and it kind of made me miss like those phenomenal scenes, like with the Malaysian mycologist back
Sure,
in
yeah.
episode 2 and stuff like that. I was kind of like, oh, like I'm fine with what they're doing here, but I those were working so well for me that this episode opening with, a flashback just 10 days into the past made me kind of miss that approach.
Was it jarring for you guys? Were you able to pick up pretty quickly on the time change? I feel like yeah, I guess once it takes a couple minutes, but you can catch up pretty quickly, right?
Yeah, I was like, oh, they because it feels like they do that a little bit here, so I was kind of prepped for it. But I also missed the sort of pre-pandemic times too. But I do think that it has this story unfold in a very specific way, and they give you more and more information about characters, about the context. And again, with the second watching, it all made so much more sense. Both of these episodes, but specifically episode 4. And so I liked that but again, you're seeing it from like this you're seeing it from a different perspective, but then you're seeing like characters fill in afterwards, and making decisions based on these things that they're slowly kind of feeding the audience. So it's an interesting way to process the storyline in the episodes. I thought it was pretty, because the way that they edited it, Stuart, I felt like it was pretty clear that these were flashbacks. But were you jarred by it?
I would say it just took me a second to realize that we were going back in time, even though it's easy, it's obvious enough when you are like, oh, this is Fedra. Fedra's getting killed, and then we're back in a jail cell with Kathleen pretty quickly, and she's asking about Henry again, or I guess originally. Um, and Kyle, you were mentioning that you didn't think she'd been in charge that long, and I would actually contest that her brother had been the leader of the resistance.
Yeah,
Henry, as we learned in this episode, turned him in order to get leukemia medication for Sam.
yeah,
Sam, who is now completely healthy from all intents and purposes, from what we can tell.
yeah,
So I think it had been some time that like basically though, the act of Henry turning over Michael, Kathleen's brother, as we learned in this episode, to Fedra and getting the leukemia meds, and maybe Dr. Edelstein was the one who like administered them and cured Sam.
mm,
That during that whole period is when Kathleen rose to power and became the shot caller for the resistance, which led to their eventual victory. So it was kind of like this whole really cool fulcrum point of Henry making that decision to do that, which actually led to the downfall of Fedra. Which I think is like a cool thing to consider when Kathleen later is talking about fate, and you're just like, don't you understand that Henry is why you got to this point? Because if your brother hadn't been killed, you would never have been in charge of the resistance. I
right.
just thought that was a cool thing to like
Well,
kind
and
of
it's
consider.
also, I mean, the other piece of this is that she orchestrated the downfall of the resistance. So even though her brother had been the leader, he did not succeed in this point, and that's something that her second in command basically says. But then again, what does that say? Because there's so much nuance in this, and so much from like a moral point of view, and there's just so many different like it is just a really interesting way to be portraying these characters. But back to sort of how they're letting these like storylines unfold. I thought that there was like a slight desaturation in how they showed these flashbacks, Stuart, which is a little bit of why I was like, oh, this is like a sort of a weird jump back, but then they're gonna like kind of like move forward into this story, and we're kind of seeing parallel storytelling, or at least enough storytelling that we're now getting the sort of blanks filled in while Joel and Ellie are off doing their thing. So it was I think we'll probably see more of this down the line, but this was a really just a complex but interesting way to show these different characters and the different sides of the story.
I can't remember whether it's in this episode or the last episode too that we see that there's essentially a big bulging, you know, thing in the ground that presumably infected are on the other side of, that's within the borders of Kansas City, that Kathleen just completely decides to ignore.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was
She
the
clo-
last. That was the
she
last
closes
episode.
she closes the door and is like, let's not tell anybody else about this.
Yeah,
Like,
Henry is still my priority. Yeah, this is clearly like a blind spot for her. And I think Perry knows and is clearly like putting across that that's a problem and that
Mhm.
they have other things they should be doing. But he's not going to argue with her because she gets stuff done. But yeah, so we know that there's a big bulging floor thing. They have a bulging floor problem, whatever that might mean. I think we can all guess.
oh no, I mean they later reveal exactly what it might be. Because Henry gives some exposition about how Fedra drove the infected underground. So
But his exposition seems to suggest that it's all been dealt with and they're all clear. It's all good. Nothing, no problems underground, right? It's just fantastic. What were you saying about Fedra, Kyle?
Oh, I was going to say a very similar thing, which is that, the story is that Fedra drove all of the infected underground. So, Kathleen and the rest of the resistance, for most of their adult lives, their enemy has been Fedra, not the infected. So, I think it kind of explains why they have that they're not putting enough emphasis on that threat.
The comparison here is quite interesting that Boston, the city, has more and more infected every year. Tess and Joel talk about that when they're trying to get out of Boston, right? Once they leave the QZ. Kansas City, by comparison, has not had any infected above ground. They might think that it's been solved for 15 years. So like 5 years after Infection Day, they've basically been good to go. And that's pretty wild to consider. Yeah, so like you're right, Kyle. And this is something I kept thinking about too, is like, so Fedra, FEMA, the federal government, this army, in Kansas apparently has been really bad. Like they are rapers and killers and murderers and torturers. But they're part of this bigger organization. But clear, like this makes it seem like it's more like city states because Kansas City Fedra, and Joel and Henry have a conversation about this in this episode, has this reputation of being way worse than other Fedras, I guess, right? So I thought that that was kind of a cool piece of world building, is that it gives you the impression that they're not a monolith. They are whatever you get in the city you're in. So I thought that was pretty neat.
I also like look, I do think that the sort of flashbacks about how bad Fedra was in the city is really important, and it helps illustrate sort of why there is this unyielding idea about the punishment and the revenge. But it's also I guess because there aren't infected walking around, there is like just a whole different dynamic here. And so that they have I don't want to say the luxury, but because they're not fighting, or because the infected were not the prime enemy, at least for them after, for the last few years. So it's interesting to see how this is different. Although you do get a little bit of the sense of that in the Boston Fedra, the QZ, a little bit, because it's not quite this brutal, but there's definitely an authoritarian mindset, and you have people trying to sort of get out from under that. But at least from what we saw, I don't think it's quite as brutal as this. And so that this gives you sort of like a different perspective where around the country, how these different Fedras evolve depending on the region, similar to what you were saying, Stuart.
I think evolve is a really important word because it's been 20 years. Like this is a
Right.
generational amount of time.
Mm-hmm.
Like generational change will happen over 20 years. And so like to consider that Fedra now is the same as it was on Eviction Day, like that's part of that what makes this interesting is that Like in one of those brief flashes of those early scenes where they're beating the hell out of all the Fedra people who were left in
Hmm.
Kansas City, one of them has really long hair, right? And I'm just like, that doesn't make any sense. Like it looks like Greg Nicotero or something is in Fedra, and I'm just like, I had a vision of like what a weird federal band of terrorists this Fedra in Kansas City must have been like. So I thought that was, but yeah, just thinking about this in terms of the world building, I think is one of the more fascinating parts of this. And then thinking about it in terms of Kathleen now and the Resistance run all of the QZ, all of the open city within this square of highways that Henry kind of illustrates to Joel and Ellie the next morning. And this is after he's also acknowledged to Joel why he is a wanted man,
Hmm.
the fact that he's a collaborator, and that really, we've already kind of gone over this, but the gray area that he inhabits because he turned over he traded one man's life for his brother,
Hmm.
and this is a question that this show and this game really try to make you consider, if not answer, over and over again.
Well, what's interesting about it and what they're forcing you to think about is that, Kathleen went on this journey to overthrow Fedra. Um, yeah, probably in part because of the way how brutal they were, but mainly because they took and they killed her brother. And so she would have gone all out, at least from what we know of her, to save her brother, and she would have probably done the same exact thing that Henry did for Sam if she were in his shoes. So
It's
that's
funny. It's funny considering the end of this episode and the speech she's giving Henry. Yeah.
great. And but you totally, I mean, she is a complete hypocrite from her perspective. It's like she's right. This is what she's doing, but as an audience member, it's just a really interesting way to examine these things. And then, you know, all the brutality that the Fedra group has rained upon this group of resistors, and her reaction in terms of like she's going to put all these collaborators to death, and is that any better? And so and we see this over and over again, The Walking Dead, that like the power, depending on who wields it, and that will shape what the next sort of philosophy or reign of whatever the ruling class is. You're going to see their values reflected in how they decide to either, I wouldn't say, well, I guess rule or govern or whatever way you want to put it. So but I thought this was a more interesting way of looking at it and viewing it and learning about it versus somehow how some other shows kind of roll this kind of idea out. So
Yeah. We definitely get a pretty one-dimensional view of her governing,
mhm,
her version of governance. It's just find Henry or door to door, whatever.
mhm.
Like we know that she has provisions because she talks about doubling the guards on the provisions. So we know that there is a stockpile of food, but we don't see her like trying to increase it or anything like that. So there are definitely like blank spots, or maybe she's not doing anything other than looking for Henry, and that certainly could be the case based on her characterization.
I don't think it is though, because I don't think that she would have such loyalty if that's all she was doing. But I think we're seeing a little window and we're seeing this like sort of final push to get Henry, and that this has become her all consuming obsession. And maybe that's kind of what it's been like, but I don't know. Maybe she feels like if she just reaches this one goal and gets rid of him, that they can just go on. I don't know. But you know, the instant karma in this particular episode is pretty good.
It certainly comes back. Kyle, are you trying to get in there?
Oh, I know. I think it's interesting that the show like kind of sort of accidentally makes an argument for fascism here. Like,
They do. It's like
Is it an accident? It's like the argument for the Imperial Galactic Empire as opposed to the Republic,
yeah,
that
it's like, and like we know that at the end of this episode ends with basically a zombie horde led by an unstoppable bloater turning their gaze toward Kansas City and walking off into the night. And it's like Kansas City, 15 years of infected free governance under Fedra, 14 days of infected free governance under the Resistance. So it just, I don't know whether exactly how intentional it was, but basically it's another story of like people who think they're doing the right thing, but cause their own downfall.
I mean, but that's the point you were trying to get at earlier. It was like, is Fedra maybe a good thing because
Yes, exactly. Like
they had kept it
they
under wraps.
I mean, obviously, this Fedra didn't seem to be that great, but like, life in the QZ seems better than life outside of the QZ, in all the examples we've seen by the end of episode 5. So,
There is a
uh,
hypothetical scenario here because we know that they have thousands of people, and there's only like 40 or 50 in that final scene. They have thousands of people, or hundreds at least, let's say, in the Resistance of Kansas City who are not there getting destroyed at the end of this episode. Um, there's a scenario where they can close the doors to the QZ and everybody is fine. Like they'll have bloaters and clickers and all kinds of crap outside the right outside the wall. The things won't be great, but they could survive at least as long as their provisions last.
it's a
Maybe?
lot of Hummers and guns that went out the door, though. I mean, we're jumping around now, but I don't know. I have to feel like that was a lot of the like best, both like fighters and also equipment that these folks have who all
Yeah,
got
I think you're right, Kyle.
Okay,
Because
I'm just trying to be optimistic here, guys. That's
yeah,
all.
well, because she was kind of doing the whole like Gary Oldman, I want everybody, like from the professional, like everybody. What do you mean by everybody? Like it felt like they were going all out to find Henry. So I think you might be right, Kyle, that's kind
Yeah. There's okay. So we have jumped to the end of the episode because that's like the money shot for this whole episode. But we also have a lot of great scenes between Sam and Henry in the attic where they're hiding at the beginning of this episode. A lot of this episode is also in American Sign Language, or written on Sam's little magic pad. I forget what those things are called.
of.
Um, this was some great stuff. Did you guys hear on the podcast with Craig and Neil and Troy Baker that Kevon, the kid who plays Sam, was found through Twitter? They just did like
Oh,
an open casting call on Twitter.
that's great. That's great.
I
Because
love the
he,
changes they made with his characterization
Yeah,
here.
that was
I
cool.
mean,
yeah,
it adds such a dimension to their relationship and to his story.
it's apparently not so easy to find like an 8-year-old American Sign Language proficient, black actor in Canada and the United States. But they just happened to find this one kid. He didn't have representation. It's his first time on screen, and he totally hits it out of the park. And those were some great scenes. And we got to see, again, with this back and forth between 4 and 5, we got to see like Kathleen finds their attic or with Perry in episode 4, and you see all the drawings on the walls. But then you get to see him and Henry, or mostly him, doing those drawings throughout this montage or these few scenes in episode 5, which that montage or series of scenes ends with Henry saying, "We're good. I know their patterns. We can make a break for it. Edelstein's probably dead. We're out of food." And then crash and gunshots, and it's the ambush scene, and you get to see it again from across the street, which I mentioned earlier, and that's super cool, but also sobering to think that they might have just walked outside and there was Brian or one of those other two suckers who ends up dead in that scene. They then though have followed, or somehow, yeah, I guess they've just kept tabs on Joel and Ellie as they went to the city and climbed up to the building. They have this interaction. They're like, "Hey, let me help you get out of the city. Here's the stuff. It's the tunnels, yo. The tunnels have no infected in them, or if there are some, you can handle it because we have no bullets and I've never killed anybody and I'm basically a good guy, even though I sold out the leader of the resistance and caused this massive schism." Not schism, really, just revolution. The tunnels scene in the show tries to model basically a long sewer section of the video game where you and Sam and Henry and Ellie are navigating a series of sewers. And in this section of the video game, you find a lot of notes if you're looking for them. And I guess you could miss them, but I don't suppose, Kyle, that do you know the story of Ish?
I don't really remember. I think I did read those when I was playing the game through, but it's been so long that's not something that sticks in my mind.
Did you pick up on it in the show at all, or?
I think it's that I think it's that community of kids who was living underground in those kind of bunkery things, who I presume are the same kid clickers that we see later in the episode. They must have, gotten found out eventually by some infected, but
Okay, well,
they explore kind of their living quarters there.
it's kind of an Easter egg for the show. In that children room, that rec room, and it's not like a community of children. It's in the video game anyway, and I think this is an allusion to it in the game, in the show. This is a sizable community that has been built up, which includes children. So they have like this rec area for the kids, and there are adults who live there too. And in the game, you're getting a lot of this context through things like those painted walls, which you see in the game environments too, but also these notes that you're finding signed by this person named Ish. You find the first note on a crashed like fishing boat, and it's like probably a reference to Ishmael, I assume, like the white whale, Moby Dick, etc. But you find probably like 8 notes from Ish throughout the game, and in the show. And in those notes, he kind of talks about setting up this community and how it's going and how it eventually falls apart. And in that room in the show, there's a drawing on the wall that says "Our protectors, Danny and Ish," and it shows these 2 dudes in like armor and holding guns. So that was a huge shout out to that kind of never really told story in the video game. That is just told through notes that you can find and read, and it's one of those really cool environmental storytelling elements of the game that you get to see. So I was really happy to see that. It's also a bit of a peaceful supermarket, like when you listen to the podcast, Druckmann and Mason talk about wanting to not exhaust the audience, and I think that's where those supermarket scenes come from, HA, that we've talked about so many times. It's
Yep.
kind of like you got to give your audience an amuse-bouche or like a palate cleanser, and those scenes really help with that. And so that's part of what that scene is doing here.
Well, yeah, and I mean, I also think for for Ellie's character, she's interacting with a lot of adults. We haven't really seen her interact with kids up until now. And, you also feel like, look, when it was going on, like, I was like, oh, this isn't gonna end well, like because it is so hopeful, and she does bond so well with Sam, and you even see Joel looking at them with some concern, and he still is trying to keep the boundaries up, even with Sam, definitely with Sam and Henry, and kind of saying to Ellie, well, they'll go their way and we can go our way, and and there's unfortunately, like at the last minute, like we see like that he relents a bit on this point, but and then it's kind of like, okay, they can come with us, and it like, not, I don't want to spoil it, well, I guess, I mean, we're going to spoil it eventually, but it almost, it gives this idea that the minute Joel or anybody lets their guard down, they're going to get hurt, or that vulnerable piece is going to get hurt. So you can see why he's so careful to keep those boundaries in place, because over and over again, and he's also worried about Ellie getting hurt, I think, clearly, but it is beautiful how they build up the relationship, but I just always have a suspicion when they're doing this, and so of course I have a lot of concerns about other things in the show in terms of the relationships between characters, but even with like the comic books, and they're making this sort of like a refrain throughout this episode, you just see like there's like a hope that Ellie has, that now she isn't completely alone, that there's, I wouldn't call it like a family, but it is kind of a family, in the sense that it isn't just her and Joel alone. And I think that there is a hopefulness in that for her. And Joel is sort of like resistant to that, but then he's almost like, okay, I guess we can do that. And, it's, but, and then the parallel between their two relationships is definitely there too. And I think it's kind of hard not to see that if you're Joel, like seeing this stuff going on between Sam and Henry, and even Henry's comment to Joel, which is, oh, you're a dad. He's like, oh, well, you might not be her dad, but you were somebody's dad. And, you know, I think it would be really hard not to see and to worry that things are going to end up the same way for him and Ellie that they are for Sam and Henry. And so I thought that was pretty well done, but also incredibly heartbreaking. And even though I watched both of these twice and it wasn't quite as heartbreaking for me as episode 3 was, it was still like the end of this episode was just, to me, just heartbreaking in a lot of ways. But
Yeah,
can we
totally,
talk about
dude.
can we talk about I would really like to talk about like the ending scene in this, and let's see.
Well,
I mean,
wait, the ending scene or the clicker
no.
scene?
The both scenes, both the
Yeah.
sort of battle scene and then the ending scene. So
Yeah, I think
So
it's time we get to the big zombie smash.
yeah.
I mean, the sniper scene also bears a little bit of mention because it also is a direct parallel from the game. And so is the final scene in the motel. Uh, the zombie eruption out of the ground is not in the game, but like there's a slight parallel to it. There's like 5 clickers that come out of the floor instead of millions. But the sniper scene is a big deal in the game because you're trying to fight this. The sniper in the game is not like 80 years old and has like 10 friends, so it's actually fairly challenging. And you're by yourself trying to just deal with it because nobody else is getting out from behind the car. I love this scene. I love the fact that Joel says it's dark and he's a terrible shot and he can't see and he's not going to shoot me. I loved all that.
Earlier, Joel kind of like he kind of has a moment as well in the truck with Ellie when they first crash, where he's just like, they're not going to hit you. It seems like a lot of Joel's strategy is just assume that other people are really terrible shots and and roll with it.
I think it's projection. Like it's like journaling. It's like positive visualization. Like you get low and you crawl to that hole in the wall. They will not hit you, and
They
it
will
comes
not
true.
hit you. Yeah.
But so it's very sad in a way. Like they kind of personalize the sniper, even though he doesn't have any lines. The dude is ancient. Craig and Mazin and Neil Druckmann talk about this in the podcast again. They're like, this guy basically commits suicide by Joel. He's like 80 years old. He was 60 when the infection started. He's done. He doesn't want to be. He doesn't want to live anymore. So he is gonna turn around and raise his gun to Joel. I thought that was hilarious. Like it's kind of like a director's commentary, and I always have enjoyed those. So I still endorse that podcast if you guys don't listen to it, or if anybody doesn't listen to it. But then he gets himself that nice sniper rifle, and then we hear Kathleen's voice on the radio, on the walkie-talkie, which they don't overuse on this show. I will just point
They
out.
do not. I thought the same thing.
Anytime a walkie-talkie is happening, we have our criticism ears perk up. But this set, I forget how long they said it was on the podcast, but it's like they built this whole town, this whole street was constructed custom for this scene, this series of scenes. So them walking down it, the sniper, the zombie eruption. I would say like the most interesting parts of the scene are not necessarily that the cars come and that they crash, like Joel manages to make the big truck crash. It's mostly the interaction between Kathleen and Henry, and then what happens next. Would you agree?
Yep.
And they're about to do some very impressive things, and I don't want to step on any of those impressive things because when the zombie horde comes out, it's genuinely awesome and terrifying at the same time. But this was what I was talking about earlier, where I just found the blocking really awkward. Like they let the resistance people get too close. Like
Yeah,
the
that was
truck,
weird.
it comes too close. And so like basically they're standing like 10 feet apart from each other. And there's like 60 dudes with assault rifles. And I'm just like, why aren't they moving? Like, why don't they just go get them? Like they can, they know they're right behind this car that's right there. This is the place where I thought that just like the way that it came out on camera made the resistance folks look a little bit ridiculous because like they could easily have shot or just run up to Ellie when they first arrive, and then secondly, like they clearly see where Ellie and Henry get off to, and they're right behind a car that's right there. So I just thought it would just seemed a little awkward to me.
I would say there's a couple of conflicting things happening with this group of yokels. Number one is Perry seems to know what he's doing. And when he sees where Joel is, he says he's up there. You two go around that way. You two go around that way. And we never see those four people. Like they
Nope.
should show up behind Joel at some point in the next 2 minutes and
But
kill
they
him.
don't. But
But
they
they never show up. Um, so I don't know. We can say that they like turned around when they heard the commotion, but the commotion doesn't start for a minute or so because Kathleen has to monologue. And
yeah, she monologues and monologues and like, there you go. Um, and this is the sort of point between her and Henry where it's just like, all right, already, we get your point. I don't know. There was just this weird. I don't know. Do you think that the people listening agree with her? Because part of me, and this to your point, Kyle, with all these people standing there with weapons, and nobody's like really getting him or taking care of this business, but they're so clearly outgunned and outpersoned, basically. Um, and then you hear her talking about how maybe his brother should have died. I don't know. Like, I don't know that to me, that's just sort of the sign of a leader that has now fully gone off the deep end. Um,
go
and
ahead,
so,
Kyle. I'm sure you want to jump in.
yeah,
No, maybe that's a good point. Maybe they're kind of like doubting their mission there because they're not that scared of the sniper because none of them are behind cover or anything. They're all just standing there,
right.
and maybe they're like legit trying to figure out whose side they're on in this little battle of wills, and whether they're ready to basically kill some kids here today.
Right, because that's
Um,
what's on the line. She's not just saying he should have died, although she is. She's also saying I'm gonna kill both you and your little brother, who's 8 years old right now, and I don't have
and
any
this other
problem
and
doing
this
it.
other and this other child.
Well, she
Hmm.
doesn't know, yeah, like that's an unknown, so we can kind of let her off the hook, but she would
No,
probably
she says
kill she
no.
would kill Ellie too.
No, she
No,
says
she
she's
she
gonna
literally
kill.
says,
Yeah, she
yeah,
goes.
she's
She
literally
was
like, we're gonna kill
responsible.
that girl who's with you too or something.
Yeah, because she says she was responsible for whatever that guy's name, that his death, and so she's not innocent. And so, like that's what was striking me is that she's sitting there basically being like, "All right, so now our mission is done, but we're not only gonna kill Henry, but we're gonna kill these two kids too." And they're complicit because they're by association
And
guilty.
as soon as she unholsters her gun, the truck starts to sink into the ground in the background. And that was some beautiful, I mean, say what you want about blocking, Kyle, but they had to have them behind that car and that close for that shot to work.
True.
I don't
True,
know, maybe
true.
not.
Well, and
Uh,
then and then I love the idea that maybe as they've been driving these Hummers out there, like the zombie horde has been following them like beneath the surface, like listening
Right.
to where the cars are going up above so they can be in just the right place at just the right time because I
Listening to
figured
the
that's supposed to be
gas
the same
bellying
bloater.
hummers.
or they're just cheek by jowl down there, dude. I mean, they could just be
Just
packed in
packed in. But
because
but
they
our heroes just
continue to
came through
come
those
out.
tunnels.
Well, not maybe not those exact ones. I don't know. Yeah,
Yeah,
there's
maybe not.
there's
Yeah.
plenty we don't know about it, but from when the truck goes down and infected start to come out of the ground until the final like kind of gantry shot of the street, there are zombies or infected coming up out of that hole. They never stop coming up out of that hole. Uh, and they're like by the end, they're carpeting the ground, the dead ones, along with the dead members of the resistance. But they are continuously pouring out of the hole in the ground. And I
This
just
vibe, this like this or this effect is what World War Z was trying to achieve. Like in that movie, the zombies are fast and there's a lot of them, and so they would occasionally form these like huge piles or basically just, but they were kind of CGI and lame and not that scary. And here like you really do feel the like ferocity and otherworldliness and how terrifying it would be to go up against a real horde, which we have not seen so far in the show. And I think it's also interesting to state that like this is the first time we've seen this a zombie on this show in like 6 hours of television.
Mhm.
Like it's
Been a
really
while.
since Tess's death or very shortly thereafter have we seen a zombie since then. So like I like that they kind of like batch it up for these big battles instead of giving it to you all over the place.
There's not only one type of horror in this infected reveal, because not only do you have that kind of horde mode where they pour out and like jump off of cars and stuff and they're everywhere and they're on top of you. You also have the bloater, which is like a boss model version of a zombie, which you've already fought in the game by this point in the storyline. They're really hard to kill. And just like if they get close to you, you're dead. And so I like the fact that they showed exactly how lethal these things are. So that's your second type of horror. Your third horror is the child clicker,
Hmm.
which is was portrayed by a child contortionist acrobat in the show, and her little weird um, flips and skittering inside that SUV were definitely the third the third flavor of my Neapolitan ice cream of horror in this episode. It was terrifying.
Yeah. And
Uh,
and I can also say, like, even after all this is going on, Perry sacrifices himself to save Kathleen. Kathleen is still focused on Henry. And that is a part that I'm just like, at this point, like, I don't know. To me, I didn't fully buy that, honestly. I just was like, she's not gonna still go after anybody at this point. She's gonna run or she's gonna like I just don't see that being when they erupted and in this way and when Perry gets taken out, I just can't see that this is gonna be her still like her reason for living. I don't know. It just felt I don't know what you think, Kyle. It just felt weird to me. Because her
I
survival
think
would
it
probably be the most important at this point, and she doesn't even it just doesn't make sense.
Yeah, I think it makes sense with her character as presented thus far, but I think they could have avoided this just by having it like giving it a little bit more distance.
Yeah.
Like have them get a little further into the woods so that the carnage is truly like far behind them and then meet up with her and then have there be like this one random clicker because it even still kind of beggars belief that these characters again because the militia was so close to where the protagonists were hiding, like they're all up in all those zombies. And even with Joel's like sniper support, it kind of like there's some pretty serious plot armor going on here for at least most of the
Yeah.
most of the protagonists, not quite all of the protagonists as it turns out. Um, but yeah, like just do it, have them get a half mile and then, you know, have her come out and then get ambushed by a zombie and you completely avoid the problem.
Right.
yeah, having her pop out and say stop instead of just shooting also is
Turning her back on like like you to your point, Stuart, turning
yeah,
her back on like 350 zombies.
Hmm.
yeah.
Mm, yeah, doesn't make sense.
So uh, that ends with her being killed by a child clicker, which again, Mason and Druckmann were very happy, like kind of gleefully rubbing their hands about the fact that she had just said kids die all the time to Henry and then is killed by a child zombie. They were like, yes, this is what we wanted. So Melanie Linsky, we loved you. You were great. You died to a child acrobatic contortionist zombie and couldn't have been happier.
This is kind of an unknowable question, but do you guys think that anybody there had ever seen a bloater before? Because most of the Kansas City folks, like Henry, seem very unfamiliar with the zombies. I mean, he knows what a clicker is, but he's obviously never seen one before this.
Perry
Um,
seemed to know exactly how bad the situation was
Yeah.
when he looks at it and he like makes eye contact with its face coral fungus and is like, you should go.
Yeah, and I
to
was trying to figure out
Kathleen.
whether Joel had that same moment of recognition or whether this is something new to Joel as well.
I always assume that when Joel said that some of the infected are 20 years old who have been around since the beginning, I always assumed that that was what he was talking about was bloaters. But I could be, that's just me making that assumption.
I feel like Joel's seen a lot, and Perry maybe knew what this was. I do think everybody else was taken aback by it because they haven't really been dealing with this, and they
In the
were
video
not.
game, the first time you see a bloater, I feel like Joel does, he calls it out by
Okay,
name.
Yeah,
So
in the
yeah,
video game, I think he definitely knows what it is.
so,
but yeah, so
And then
in,
and then we kind of alluded to this earlier, but then the horde like basically turns as one and heads toward Kansas City, and I don't really know whether they're. We talked about this a while ago. I don't really know whether they're going to go down this path, but I definitely think there is a case to be made here for some sort of hive mind. Like
mhm.
they are really working in coordination in a way that that could be deliberate. Like the bloater seemed to almost kind of be leading the charge as he kind of like roars and like shakes his arm and then like stomps off toward Kansas City. And so I'm curious to see whether they pick up that thread or whether I'm reading too much into things.
I'd love to see that bonus content episode where it's the siege of Kansas City, well, what's left of them. So, but I think based on you and HA, you don't have too many hopes for the leftovers of the resistance.
Zero.
Yeah, I think
If
maybe
they're
pockets of them could have gotten away, but definitely not surviving in Kansas City. I think this horde is taken care is going to mop up in there.
Yeah, maybe if they can't get those QZ doors closed, they're definitely done. But the final scenes of this episode, at first you're like, oh, this is sweet, this is nice. Ellie is reading to Sam. Joel and Henry are like having dad talk, but really dad, not like non-dad figure to other non-dad figure because it's like brother to complete non-related person. Talking trash about Endure and Survive, and and there is some real parallels to the video game here, where Ellie and Sam have this conversation about what scares you, and Ellie reveals, and it's really Ellie's revelation, I think, that is most important because Sam, well, doesn't stick around that long, is that she's scared of ending up alone. So that's kind of the biggest takeaway from the scene, and that's really kind of cruel to say considering how it ends up.
Yep.
But you know what? Only Joel and Ellie are on the artwork for this show, so none of us should be that surprised in how it ends up. Um,
I wasn't surprised, but what I was surprised about is that, Sam and Henry were surrounded by all of these infected. And I would imagine that, and maybe this is just me being myself, but I would imagine if you go through that, one of the things you say to them is, hey, did any of you get bitten? Or like inspect somebody for bites. I mean, because we're also, Joel, who's like the most cautious about this kind of thing. Although maybe he doesn't want them to check out Ellie too closely, as he said, he doesn't want people to know what had happened to her. But he does give some, uh, like, share some information with them. But like, I don't know. Like, I think that it would have been obvious that Sam was bitten, just the way he's acting and the way, it's not like it's a pretty severe bite on his pants.
I mean, the
I
two
don't
of them under that car just kicking the clickers away
Right.
is perfect opportunity to get
Right.
bitten.
So anyway, I
Yeah.
was bothered by that. And then, you know, I'm also really bothered by the fact that, I know Ellie's trying to help and she thinks she has his magic blood. So she tries to like give him a weird infusion, which, I think we can all understand and agree that that's not going to be enough to do it, whatever kind of antibodies or whatever resistance she's got going on in her
it
blood.
depends how magic your blood is, dude. I
I guess
mean,
so. If you're a magic vampire, maybe. I don't know. But anyway, I wouldn't have been going to sleep in a room with Sam. I can tell you that much.
well, yeah, her falling asleep on guard duty also plays into future episodes on this show. So I was kind of happy to see that she is not immune to this effect.
I mean,
Mm-hmm.
and she has a history of saying she's not going to fall asleep and then falling asleep.
And then she falls asleep. You're right. You're right. You're right. So
But
anyway, but this was
yeah,
pretty heartbreaking. Ended up where I
yeah,
thought it would end. Instead of this group of four going off together and offering support to each other, it ends incredibly tragically. I did think that this scene was really well done because, Ellie's fighting, for her life because Sam is really really strong and just caught her off guard because she was asleep. And then Joel and Henry burst into the room, and the tension here is really great. And then and it is incredibly tragic, but I mean, I think I saw where it was going, but there was this moment because, Henry's looking at his little brother, and he's looking at his little brother who he saved, and he knows exactly what's happening. And then he does what he has to, which is like to kill Sam, and it's really horrible. I just, and I mean, this pulls at your heartstrings. It's deliberate, but the facial expressions of all these actors were just incredibly well done, heartbreaking, sad, and they show all the feelings. I don't know how you were feeling, Stuart, Kyle, but this was really hard to watch. I'll admit I did not watch this scene a second time. I just couldn't do it. So
Kyle.
Yeah, I mean, especially since you know that Henry has never killed anybody before, and then the first person that he has to kill is his
yeah.
little brother. It's just, I mean, it's so tragic that it actually crosses a line into like pseudo manipulative, where I'm just like, we have been basically bamboozled into a situation of like maximal pathos here. You know what I mean? Like it feels a tiny bit contrived, where it's just like, what's the saddest fucking thing we can do here? That we can possibly squeeze out of this. But I mean, it works. It's heartbreaking, and when Henry kills himself, it's a incredible acting showcase for Bella Ramsey, because she makes this kind of like little whimper that is just kind of drives the point completely home about how quickly she's having to grow up, and the horrifying things that she's seen. That's nobody can escape this without some serious PTSD and just being a very fucked up person. So yeah,
Well,
it's
I
so
mean, I
sad.
think it's also this thing where it's like Joel is almost like, see, this is why we can't be close, and this is why
Yeah.
I was building up my boundaries. Um, and it's hard not to see themselves, I think, in Sam and Henry.
In the video game, you kind of jump from here into a future scene, from like right from that suicide to cut to black to now it's the future and we're in the West and months have elapsed. And Joel is much more cold to Ellie going forward, as opposed to in the show we get to see them actually burying Henry and Sam, and Ellie is actually being colder to Joel,
Mm-hmm.
in a way, just like, let's just go, let's walk west. Um, yeah, I watched this last night and had to watch something else before I could go to sleep as a palate cleanser, just because it was, yeah, this really does punch you right in the feels. So, but that brings us to the end of episode 5. I know we're behind. Like tonight, episode 7 airs, I think. So
Mhm.
we have still some catching up to do. The next time we get together, we might do 1 or 2 episodes. And I'm sorry that we were so late in getting this onto the airs, but we are doing our best. Fantastic 2 episodes, I think, and watched together and watched more than once really helps, in my opinion.
Agree.
Yeah, I totally agree.
If you want to get a hold of us, you can email us at reanimatedpodcast@gmail.com. We're on Twitter at reanimatedpcast for now. And you can catch all of our episodes on the internet at reanimated.podbean.com. I'm Stuart, and I'm saying goodbye and thank you.
Until next time, ciao. And thanks for listening.
See you.